There's a detail buried inside every major heat wave that almost nobody thinks to ask about. Not the temperature, not the drought, not even the wildfires. It's this: where does your electricity actually come from on the single hottest day of the year, the day you need air conditioning the most? And the answer, for tens of millions of people across Europe and beyond, is starting to get complicated in a way that most people have never heard explained. Because right when demand for electricity spikes to its highest point of the entire year, some of the largest power plants on the continent are being forced to do the opposite of what you'd expect. They're slowing down, in some cases, shutting off completely. Not because they're broken, not because they're out of fuel, because of water temperature. If deep dives like this into the hidden mechanics behind real disasters are what brought you here, subscribe now. We go this deep every single week. Let's start from the beginning. To understand why a heat wave can force a nuclear power plant to throttle back, you first have to understand what a nuclear plant is actually doing, mechanically, minute to minute. At its core, a nuclear reactor is an extremely sophisticated way of boiling water. The nuclear fission happening inside the reactor core generates enormous heat. That heat turns water into steam. The steam spins a turbine. The turbine spins a generator. The generator produces electricity. It's the same basic principle as a coal plant or a gas plant. Heat turns water to steam. Steam spins a turbine. Nuclear fission is just the heat source instead of burning fuel. But here's the part that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Once that steam has done its job spinning the turbine, it has to go somewhere. It needs to be cooled back down into liquid water so it can cycle through the system again. And cooling down enormous volumes of steam continuously, day and night, for the entire operating life of a reactor requires a genuinely staggering amount of cooling capacity. Most nuclear plants get that cooling capacity from a nearby body of water, a river, a lake, sometimes the ocean. The plant draws in cool water from the source, uses it to condense the steam back into liquid, and then returns that water, now warmer than when it came in, back to the river or the sea. This is called once-through cooling, and it's one of the most common designs for large power plants around the world, nuclear and otherwise. Under normal conditions, this system works quietly and efficiently for decades. The river provides a steady, reliable, essentially free source of cooling water. The plant returns that water slightly warmer than it found it. The river absorbs and disperses that heat as it continues flowing, and the whole cycle repeats endlessly without much drama. Now here's where a heat wave changes everything. During a prolonged period of extreme heat, the kind of multi-week heat dome pattern that has become increasingly common across Europe in recent summers, river water temperatures don't stay constant. Rivers absorb heat from the air around them, from direct sunlight, and from reduced water flow as drought conditions cause water levels to drop. A river that might normally sit at 18 or 20 degrees Celsius in summer can climb into the mid to high 20s during a sustained heat wave, sometimes higher in shallow, slow-moving stretches. That matters enormously for a power plant relying on that water for cooling, because the water isn't just there to be cool, it's there to absorb heat from the plant's systems and carry that heat away. If the water going into the plant is already warm, it has far less capacity to absorb additional heat before it becomes a problem. Physics doesn't care that the water started out warmer for natural reasons. The plant still needs to bring its systems down to a safe operating temperature, and warmer intake water makes that job dramatically harder. This is where environmental regulation enters the picture, and it's worth explaining honestly because it's the part of this story that creates the most direct and uncomfortable tension. Nearly every country operating nuclear plants near rivers has environmental regulations governing exactly how warm the water coming out of the plant is allowed to be when it's returned to the river, and how much warmer that outflow water can be compared to the water already in the river. These rules exist for a genuinely important reason. River ecosystems, particularly fish and aquatic invertebrates, are highly sensitive to water temperature. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, Many fish species have specific temperature thresholds beyond which their metabolism, reproduction, or basic survival becomes seriously compromised. A power plant continuously discharging water that's too hot into an already stressed river during a heat wave can trigger fish kills, damage spawning grounds, and cause lasting ecological harm. So the regulations exist to prevent exactly that outcome. Typically, a plant is permitted to discharge water only up to a certain maximum temperature, or only up to a certain temperature difference above the river's existing temperature, often somewhere in the range of a few degrees Celsius above ambient, though the specific limits vary significantly by country and by individual river system. Here's the collision. During a heat wave, the river is already running hot. That means the plant has much less headroom before its discharge water would violate the temperature limit. And because the intake water is warmer to begin with, the plant's cooling systems are working harder just to bring the water down to an acceptable range, which means the water often comes out hotter relative to what it would be on a normal day, even before you factor in the reduced legal headroom. The result is a genuine bind. The plant can continue operating at full capacity, which would mean discharging water that exceeds the legal temperature limit and risks real ecological damage to the river. Or the plant can reduce its power output, which reduces the amount of heat it needs to dissipate, which brings the discharge temperature back within legal limits at the cost of generating less electricity. In practice, plant operators are legally required to choose the second option. When river temperatures approach the regulatory threshold, nuclear plants across France, Germany, Switzerland, and other countries with significant nuclear generation capacity are required to reduce output, and in more extreme cases, temporarily shut down entirely, specifically to protect the river ecosystem from thermal damage. France provides the clearest example of this dynamic in action, because France generates a larger share of its electricity from nuclear power than any other country in the world. Roughly 2/3 of the country's total electricity generation comes from its fleet of nuclear reactors, many of which sit along major rivers, including the Rhône, the Loire, and the Garonne. During major summer heat waves in recent years, French grid operators have had to reduce nuclear output at multiple plants simultaneously, sometimes taking individual reactors offline entirely for days at a time, purely because river water temperatures approached or exceeded regulatory thresholds. Now think about the timing of when this actually happens. It doesn't happen randomly. It happens specifically during the most intense, most sustained heat waves. The exact same weather events that simultaneously drive electricity demand to its highest point of the year, because millions of homes and businesses are running air conditioning continuously to survive the heat. The moment when the country needs maximum electricity generation capacity is the exact same moment when a significant chunk of that generation capacity is being forced offline by the same heat wave driving the demand. This isn't a hypothetical edge case. It's a structural collision built into the physical design of how these plants generate and dissipate heat, colliding directly with environmental protections that exist for legitimate ecological reasons. Neither side of that collision is wrong. The rivers genuinely need protection from thermal pollution. The grid genuinely needs electricity during a heat wave. But those two legitimate needs are fundamentally in tension. It's worth being precise about the scale of what's actually at stake here, because the numbers involved are large enough to matter for an entire national grid, not just a single power plant. A large nuclear reactor can generate somewhere in the range of 900 to 1,600 megawatts of electricity, depending on the specific reactor design and generation. A single megawatt can power roughly 1,000 average homes for an hour, which means one large reactor running at full output can supply electricity to somewhere between 900,000 and over 1 million homes simultaneously. When multiple reactors across a country's nuclear fleet are forced to reduce output or shut down during the same heat wave, because they're often clustered along the same river systems, meaning the same heat and drought conditions affect several plants at once, The combined reduction in generating capacity can run into the thousands of megawatts. That's a gap that grid operators then have to fill through other means, often by importing electricity from neighboring countries, drawing down whatever reserve capacity exists, or in worst-case scenarios, implementing targeted reductions in supply to specific regions or industrial users. This creates a secondary layer of risk that compounds the direct danger of the heat itself. A heat wave is already dangerous because of the direct physiological toll extreme temperatures take on the human body, particularly on older adults, infants, outdoor workers, and anyone with an existing heart or respiratory condition. Air conditioning is one of the most effective tools available for reducing heat-related illness and death during these events. If the same heat wave that's creating the danger is simultaneously reducing the electrical grid's ability to power the air conditioning that protects people from that danger, you have a feedback loop where the crisis makes its own mitigation less available at precisely the moment mitigation matters most. Grid operators are aware of this dynamic and plan around it as best they can. Cross-border electricity trading within interconnected grids, particularly the heavily integrated European grid, which allows countries to buy and sell electricity across borders in real time, provides a meaningful buffer. If nuclear output drops in France during a heat wave, France can import electricity from Germany, Spain, or other neighboring countries whose generation mix might be less directly affected by the same conditions, assuming those countries have surplus capacity to sell, which isn't always guaranteed if the same heat wave is affecting a wide enough geographic area. Beyond nuclear plants, this same basic vulnerability applies to other types of thermal power generation that rely on water cooling. Coal plants and gas-fired plants using once-through or evaporative cooling systems face similar constraints during extreme heat, though the specific regulatory triggers and thresholds differ by fuel type and by country. Nuclear plants tend to draw more attention in this conversation, both because they represent such a large share of baseload generation in countries like France, and because the public conversation around nuclear power is already highly charged, making any operational vulnerability more likely to become a visible news story. It's also worth understanding what happens on the engineering side when a plant does have to reduce output, because it's not simply a matter of flipping a switch. Nuclear reactors are designed with substantial operational flexibility, and modern reactor operators can adjust output, a process called load follow, to some degree without needing a complete shutdown. Reducing power output reduces the amount of heat the reactor core is generating, which reduces the amount of cooling water needed, which reduces the volume and temperature of the water being discharged back into the river. In many cases, a partial reduction in output is sufficient to bring discharge temperatures back within legal limits without requiring a full shutdown. However, in the most extreme and sustained heat events, partial reduction isn't always enough. If river temperatures climb high enough, or if drought conditions have reduced river flow to the point where there simply isn't enough water volume to provide adequate cooling, regardless of temperature, plants may need to reduce output far more significantly, or, in some documented cases, take a reactor offline entirely until conditions improve. Restarting a reactor that's been brought fully offline is a more involved process than adjusting output on a reactor that's still running, which is part of why grid operators generally try to manage these situations through partial output reductions across multiple plants rather than full shutdowns wherever operationally possible. There's an important nuance here that's easy to miss if you only hear the headline version of this story. This is not primarily a safety issue in the sense that most people might initially assume when they hear the words nuclear plant and heat wave in the same sentence. These reductions and shutdowns are not typically happening because the reactors themselves are in danger of overheating to a point that threatens the reactor core or triggers a safety-critical event. Nuclear plants have multiple independent, redundant cooling and safety systems specifically engineered to prevent that outcome under a very wide range of conditions, including extreme heat. The reductions being discussed here are fundamentally an environmental compliance issue and an operational efficiency issue, not a reactor safety issue. The plant is choosing to reduce output specifically to comply with environmental protections for the river, not because the reactor itself is at risk. That said, it's also worth being clear that extreme heat does still create genuine engineering challenges beyond just the cooling water question. Extreme ambient air temperatures can reduce the overall thermal efficiency of any power plant, nuclear or otherwise, because the fundamental physics of a heat engine, which is what any thermal power plant ultimately is, depends partly on the temperature difference between the heat source and the surrounding environment. A hotter surrounding environment, whether that's hot air or hot cooling water, reduces that temperature differential and makes the entire energy conversion process somewhat less efficient, independent of any regulatory constraints. Looking forward, this is a problem that energy planners and utility companies are actively working to address, because the underlying trend driving it, more frequent, more intense, longer-lasting heat waves, is not expected to reverse. Several approaches are being pursued in parallel. Some newer or retrofitted plants are being equipped with cooling towers rather than relying purely on once-through river cooling, which allows a plant to recirculate and reuse cooling water rather than continuously drawing from and discharging into a river, significantly reducing the plant's vulnerability to river temperature constraints. Though cooling towers come with their own trade-offs, including higher water consumption through evaporation and substantial construction costs for retrofitting older facilities. There's also ongoing work on updating and, in some cases, temporarily relaxing environmental discharge regulations during genuine grid emergencies, allowing regulators to grant temporary exemptions that let plants exceed normal thermal discharge limits for short periods during extreme heat events, specifically to prevent broader electricity shortages, while still requiring monitoring and mitigation to limit ecological harm as much as possible. This kind of exemption has been used in France during some of the more severe recent heat waves, reflecting a recognition that during a genuine grid emergency, the trade-off calculation between electricity supply and short-term ecological protection sometimes needs to be reassessed, even though it remains a genuinely difficult and contested decision each time it comes up. The bigger picture here connects to something worth sitting with. As heat waves become a larger and more frequent part of how a warming climate expresses itself, the systems that were built decades ago to generate and deliver electricity are increasingly running into physical limits that their original designers never had to seriously plan around. Once-through river cooling made complete sense as an engineering solution when it was designed, under the climate conditions and river flow patterns that existed at the time. It's now colliding with a climate reality that includes hotter, lower rivers, precisely during the periods when electricity demand is highest. This is far from the only place in modern infrastructure where that same basic pattern shows up. Legacy systems built around assumptions about a stable climate running into a climate that's no longer behaving the way it used to. But the nuclear cooling example is a particularly clean illustration of the underlying dynamic. Because the physics involved are straightforward and well understood, the regulatory trade-offs are explicit and documented, and the timing collision between cause and effect, the same heat wave creating both the demand spike and the supply constraint, happens in the same place, on the same day, making the connection unusually visible compared to many other climate infrastructure interactions that play out more gradually or diffusely. Understanding this mechanism doesn't require taking a position on nuclear power itself, whether you think it should play a larger or smaller role in the broader energy transition. What it does require is recognizing that the electrical grids most societies depend on were built around a set of physical assumptions about water temperature, water availability, and weather patterns that are shifting, and that the operational flexibility to absorb that shift through cooling tower retrofits, expanded cross-border electricity trading, updated regulatory frameworks, and genuine investment in grid resilience is not something that happens automatically. It requires deliberate planning, sustained investment, and honest acknowledgement of a tension that doesn't have a clean, cost-free resolution. That's the real story behind why the lights sometimes flicker in unexpected ways during the hottest days of the year. Not a single point of failure, but a physical collision between the water a power plant needs to cool itself and the water a river needs to stay alive, playing out on exactly the days when everyone downstream needs electricity the most.